Okay, so starting off in the middle of the functions. Recall your say my name function from before. It should say my name is Ada, but with your name. It can currently only say your name though. Let's upgrade it to allow anyone's name, and let's have it return instead of logging. So what would be the first thing I would write to solve this problem? A piece of ice got stuck in my mouth. What was that? Function. Yep. Cool. So that's the keyword. That's why it turns purple. It's a keyword in JavaScript. That means that we're telling the computer that we are declaring a function. So then what would come next? Say my name. That's the name that we have decided to give it, so the computer knows that when we say these exact words with these exact casings, it's going to know what we're talking about. So we say function, computer knows we're declaring a function, we give it a name, now the computer knows, okay, I'm going to store this in this place in memory, and when I see these specific characters again, I'm going to that place in memory again. Okay, so what's next?
Would you go down a line and give a definition to name?
Close. You're very close. Not quite. We need to allow this function to take in input because we don't want it to just say one thing. So in order to have the function be reusable, we want to have it have parameters. So where would we put the parameters in the function?
We put open parentheses.
Yes. There you go. See how it changed colors again? Because now it knows it's a function. It's understanding, okay, these are the parameters, this is the name. The computer's following along with us. So now it specifically says up here that it currently only says your name. It doesn't say what name to give the parameter. So I'm going to do spinny top just to further drive home that naming your parameters does not matter. Naming your variables does not matter. Unless it says in the test to do that, then please do that. Okay, so now there's something that we talked about yesterday that I could use that would make this very easy, and I could do this in one line. I'll give you guys a hint. It starts with return. I can have this function return something that, right here, I can use string concatenation to append the name to the string my name is and return. So what are my next lines? Give you a little hint. We can do this right here. My name is space. And then if we were to concatenate, how would we do that? It's a special operator. A plus sign. Spinny top. Again, semicolon doesn't matter. Oh, let me blow this up for you. Yep. Yeah, if you can't see it, let me know, because I just get caught up in, like, tunnel vision this. If you can't see it, feel free, by all means, to shout that out. So it seemed like a couple people struggled with this, so that's good. I can dive in on this a little bit. So what we're doing, line by line, just to reiterate, just to drive this home, I'm telling the computer that I want a function because we're in the function unit. We're talking about functions. It's very common in JavaScript. We give the function a name, and so we know that we're doing this right because they change colors. Keywords in JavaScript will change colors. So this is very nice. It's a really great example. Here we have function in purple. The name of the function is in blue, so we know that the compiler read it correctly and that it's not a problem. An example of where that would be a problem is if this was a capital letter. You don't want to capitalize anything at the beginning because that is considered a constructor, and I'll show you guys that in REPL. And it does it with like pretty much everything if I remember correctly. So we have all the code we've been going over. It should be able to just come in here. If I type in test, it's black. But if I come in and I do capital T, see how it changes color? The computer is expecting this to be a constructor, and this is not something we're going to dive into right now, but this is why we have to capitalize all of our variables with, or not capitalize all our variables at the beginning. It's called camel casing. JavaScript is camel cased because it looks like a camel's humps when you're typing extra words, right? It's kind of, you know, a funny way of imagining. There's also snake case. There's screaming case. There's all lowercase. There's quite a few. It depends on the language that you're using. We're using JavaScript, so we're camel casing. So don't capitalize again because you're going to. Let me see if I can actually even just console log this. I would need a real constructor. So it's a function. See, even though it says object, I typed in object with a capital O, and it's saying it's a function because its function is to create an object. That's why we call it a constructor. But this is like very low level stuff. Like this is essentially when you type in var this equals that. JavaScript under the hood is using this, the constructor, to construct this variable. So don't like worry about understanding constructors. Just know that they're there and that they exist, and you reference them with a capital letter at the beginning of your variable name. So don't make that mistake. That's why it changes color here. Again, that's a good telltale sign that you could be doing something right or wrong. If you see something that shouldn't be changing color, that's a sign where you're like, wait, that shouldn't be happening. Because if we type in, let's see, bject, and we say var bject equals 20, it doesn't change color. You see that? But if I run it, it's obviously going to work because I have it declared right there. So if you see colors changing when they shouldn't be, check that out. Make sure you know what you're doing. So the reason I was talking about that is we have these different colors to designate different parts of the function. So purple is the actual function declaration. It's like the function constructor, right? Like we were just talking about with objects. So under the hood, JavaScript is like, okay, I'm going to use the function constructor to construct a function called sayMyName. That's why it's blue. Oh, sorry. Yeah. In proper convention, let's change that back. It didn't change the color, but calling it would have been a problem because it would have assumed it's a constructor. So always camel case. In here, orange represents parameters, and parameters are awesome. I love parameters. They're essentially what make functions work, because without parameters, you wouldn't be able to, like, without parameters, a calculator could only do 1 plus 1, essentially. Like, without being able to enter parameters into a function, it really limits the functionality of functions. No pun intended, but by inserting this here, we allow it so that if somebody was to come along on the bottom, I'm just going to take a quick sip. Pardon me. So now if somebody came down here, they did say my name, Greg, say my name, Joe. Like we could reuse this. All of a sudden, it becomes a more versatile function because we're declaring this parameter right here in orange. And again, this is a parameter in orange. These are arguments. They're almost the same thing. If you call them the same thing, I will understand what you're talking about. You will see them called different things in documentation though, but they are almost the same thing. Parameter in orange, because it's with the declaration. Arguments are the actual data that are going to take place of the parameter. So you can imagine, if I didn't have a parameter, how could I possibly run this function to say different names? Right? It's impossible. There's no reference to spinny top anymore. It's no longer up here. If I try to run this, it's going to fail. It has no idea what spinny top is. How are we going to allow other people to come in and say their name? Well, we have to come up with like a variable. You can think of a parameter as like a temporary variable to represent what you want to come into the function, the data that you expect to come into the function. A good naming convention at the beginning might be to name the data type you expect to be coming in. So in this instance, it would be a string. So I could say something like, this is expected to be a string. You got it. Right, so in case you have a hard time keeping track of what data type your parameter should be, you can name it after what data type it should be. Again, I'm pretty sure string is a reserved word. Let's see, I just want to double check that. Let me get rid of these. A lot of the time you will never see people, okay, so it's still correct, so I guess it's not a keyword. I don't recommend this. What you'll see developers do more often than not is like shorten them. So str is string, but then you don't have to worry about hitting that constructor. You don't have to worry about it being a keyword. So like if I typed array, that's dangerous, because if at some point in my function all of a sudden A becomes capitalized, it's referencing the wrong thing, because now the data is different, the address is different, it's going to error out. So we want to make sure that when we're naming our parameters that we're naming them in a way where we're able to understand at a quick glance exactly what's coming in, and then we know exactly what to do with it. So in this instance, this would be expected user input name. I'm a personal fan, and I'm a junior. I'm by no means like a computer science god or anything like that, but I personally find learning for me is a lot easier if I really like painstakingly name out my variables, because no matter how much time I spend away from this function, I'm always going to remember exactly what this function was intended to do. Because I can come in here and let's say 10 years down the line, I've forgotten how to code, I don't really remember, I'm trying to get back into it. I could come into this function and be like, oh man, what was I doing? Let's see, it says say my name with expected user input name. Okay, so it probably is intended to say your name, right? Like it almost describes exactly what it's intended to do right here. So do what works for you. I'm not telling you to do this. If doing very simple like str, arr, like those sorts of things works for you, awesome. Like just do what works for you, but I just wanted to show a couple different examples of like how I like to name parameters and interact with them. And that is essentially how you will. Let me take a look.
I didn't put a space initially after my name.
Oh, you know what? I already see. Is it
Let me see here.
I spaced it in.
Oh yeah. That's what we call one-off errors. Let's see my name. Calls console log. Oh, we're on the wrong one. highlights everything. Control A stands for select all, and then all you have to do is actually just paste, and it will erase what's selected. So now if you run the test there, that should work. Because the other one is showing how console log works. So you were returning and didn't want you to return. That's the one you should have console log. Yeah. That's why you were asking about it. Yeah, I was like, no, that was the other one. There you go.
Question. I couldn't see it there. I just see a black box. So.
Yeah, I apologize.
No, no.
So you can put anything in the parentheses that you're expecting to get as the end result.
Pretty much, yeah. And again, I like this personally because it helps me keep track of exactly the data type. Because one thing I love about C#, just to kind of go off on a crazy tangent, is in order to declare a function in C#, you have to say what the data type is. So it would be string user name, right? And then the next one would be like integer number of students. Obviously it's way more code, but that makes it like obviously way more clear as to exactly what's going on. So one thing with JavaScript is you gotta keep that in mind and make sure you're naming your parameters in a way that's easy to understand and you'll remember. One good reference is like if you can close this project down and you can reopen it in a year and you can still understand what's going on, then that's perfect. You know, that's my personal take on it. So now we are working on number 4. This is the multiple parameters, which is awesome. More parameters, the better. So we're going to write a function that takes multiple parameters. Awesome, could have inferred that. One for your name and one for your title. I don't have a title, I'm unlanded. Let's write a function called formal greeting. So first thing, function, yep. Thank you. I was hoping it would take a little longer so I could take a sip of coffee. Kind of gives us the next step. Do that one for you. It's called formal greeting. Does take parameters. So the first parameter should be a string. Name. And title. Kind of gave that away. I was going to say how do you separate parameters, but then I accidentally on habit put there's something on there. So if you want to insert more than one parameter inside of a function, it has to be separated by commas. You'll see this also, touched on this, but again, var with objects and keys, if you have these are separated with commas as well. Right? Also, arrays are separated with commas. Other than that, that's probably the 3 places you're going to see commas in JavaScript. So in parameter declaration and function declaration, when you're declaring your parameters, that's where you'll see these commas. This is incorrect, don't do that. We'll error out unless you have actually something to put there. And then of course, again, the objects, the data will be separated with commas, and then in arrays, the data will be separated with commas. That's about the 3 places you're going to see commas in JavaScript. So with that out of the way, we can open our code block. We do that with an opening curly brace. I hit enter and it intelligently just closes it and indents me. So now we want to return a string that is formatted like so. My name is Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. Anybody think they can do it? Want to come up and try? So remember, when we're returning, it's still value and it's still a data type. Functions take in variables and they output variables, essentially. So a function is going to return something that, well, it doesn't have to return something, but we want it in this instance to return something that we can use over and over, just like we had in the example just previously, where instead of having it only say one thing because there's no parameters, we can have it say whatever title we want with whatever, with whatever name we want.
We don't do like we did before. You return, my name is, plus, I don't know, Ray Palmer.
Title plus name.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Hey, I was going there.
Awesome, exactly.
Uh-oh, we have to go down.
Yeah. Oh. So we just missed a space in there. Just I kind of brisked over that. Again, one-off errors. You'll probably hear me say this a lot more now. This would be considered a one-off error, and they're the bane of developers' existence because, it's easy to find a problem if the problem's enormous, right? Like if an entire building is on fire, you're not going to go like, "Where's the fire?" But if somebody's holding a match in one of the rooms, it's going to be a lot harder to find where that fire is coming from, right? And that would be a one-off error, and that's what you're going to have to deal with at times when you're trying to problem solve. Obviously here, it's very apparent what this one-off error was, but a one-off error in essence is exactly that, where everything that you've written is correct, everything's spelled correctly, you wrote all your functions, you're calling them, but you accidentally missed one thing, which is, in this case, the space. So I have a one-off error in my code right now, and I can fix that simply by coming in, adding another plus, and just throwing in a space. And white space doesn't matter. Code formatting, oops, that matters. If I wanted to have them all tucked together because they look better to me, then by all means. I hope we can do this with template strings too. I want to show you guys template strings, but I have a feeling it's probably looking for concatenation. But I think that template strings would be a lot easier. So that was the one-off error. I'll show you guys again. So now it's correct. If I erase this, well, still need to add title and name. We get that one-off error because I am one character off the actual correct answer. You see, and this is a well-written test. I like this test. So it shows you, the keys are right here. This is what I'm expecting. This is what you actually gave me. So this is how this is denoted in most tests. Most tests will show you these keys. So expected was my name is Rear Admiral space Grace Hopper. But what I gave them actually was my name is Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. So that one-off error is fixed by adding that one space.
Oh,
There's
so
space
quotations
between
are
the two words.
Yes, because it's a string, so it's not a variable. It's an anonymous string. Like you can declare a number. Like, nice. How did I do that? The heck? Okay, I like it. Like, is my keyboard working? Yeah. So like 1 can be 1. You don't need 1 to be like. If I want to use 1, I don't need to go var 1 equals 1. Like I can just say console.log 1 plus 1. I'm not going to get an error that's like, what is 1? Because that would be really, really, really dumb. So that actually works in most coding languages as well. It's frowned upon in the lower level languages simply because it obfuscates exactly what is going on in the function. You'll find that with lower level languages, they typically have all of their variables declared at the top, and it's read kind of like a dictionary or a table of contents. Here we don't have to worry about that. All we have to do is know the way we denote variable types. And so when I add this extra plus here, come in between, and I put quotes, well, I'm used to using an IDE, and I put quotes. Right now this is an empty string. I don't need to declare it to a variable. I don't necessarily need the computer to remember this in a space in memory. It doesn't need extra computing power. It's just, I can throw in these quotes and JavaScript knows it's a string. I don't have to declare this variable as a string. And that's actually what we're doing right here as well, right? In here, all I'm doing, if you can imagine, you know, my name wasn't there, all we're doing is just throwing in the space right here. So that's what I did there. I realized that I failed the test because I didn't have a space. So I came back up to my concatenation. I put just a normal string that doesn't need to be declared, and I can just put a space in there. And so that way, when I finally run the test, it'll be complete because then it has the space in there that it was looking for.
I'm scaring myself because I'm catching up. I commented out after that, and I put a note in there what I did.
There you
So
go.
I come back and look at it, and it'll make sense.
Yeah, there you go. I like it. Comments are great too. Like, I'm always commenting my code. Sure. And I showed this to as an example, but I think this is bad coding formatting. This is definitely what you're going to see more often than not. And then I'm going to erase that, and I'll move that down. So this is everything that's going on. I want a whiteboard, but because I'm recording, it's kind of odd. But essentially, let's do this. I can show you guys. Right, so same thing, colorized. We have, instead of colorizing them orange, they're italicized, right? So we still know that these are being picked up as parameters because their font is different than the font down here. So we can still tell that they're different. Right here, we do formal greeting, and we do Greg and the unlanded. My name is the unlanded Greg, but I can come in here, and again, I could do Joe, the coffee man. Well, actually, it'll only run the bottom one, but because JavaScript is single-threaded, it only can operate on one function at a time. So since I called the function twice, it did run it twice, but it only returned the final value at the end of the document. So that's why we're only seeing that. If you want to see all of the data, all you have to do is simply wrap it in a console log, and that will evaluate the function to the console to save it, and then we get the actual return value from this function. But the point I'm trying to make is that by having these parameters, we're able to insert any type of data inside of these functions and oh, I misspelled coffee. And it still works, it's still versatile. If we just had this with no, I'll do a function informal greeting, because the other one is formal, right? No parameters. The only thing I could ever possibly do is do return, hey man, I wish I had parameters so I could return something else. And so now, informal greeting, if I try to run this with Greg, the guy, get the same thing. Okay? I think you guys get my point, but we'll do Mike, the producer. Same dang thing. Hopefully this is exactly because the way I declared this function with no parameters. So no matter how many things I put in here, no matter what, it's always going to just return this statement. Is that still good for you, John? Okay. Is that a little bit better? Hopefully. Yeah. So it's not erroring out because it's going to let me put in the parameters. It would probably error out if I tried to do something like that I wasn't allowed to do with the parameters, but since there's no parameters, it's literally just ignoring them. It's not doing anything with them. So if you imagine this more like a calculator, how going back to that example, you can imagine if there was a calculator function with no parameters, it could only ever return one evaluation. No matter how hard we try to get it to not do that. Dum2 plus 2. Dumb is not defined. Oh. Maybe I'm dumb. Hey. There we go. It's returning 2 because that's what I told it to return, because we weren't able to access parameters. However, if I come in here and I type in AB, all of a sudden the world of possibilities has been opened, because we can use this on not a number. Not a number? What am I putting in there? Oh, it needs 2 numbers. Duh, jeez. Sorry. There we go. That's how you add. Now you can see I can put anything in here, and it'll still give me the output. I don't need to create a function 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3. You know, I can put any values in this function, and now I have so much more versatility with this function than if I was to just have it with no parameters and unable to actually return dynamic data. See, return A plus B. Okay, A, B. Is not defined, okay? About 1 and 1. Still not defined. So that's the importance of parameters. That's why we need them up here in these curly braces, because then when we enter our code block right here, denoted by the curly braces, that's where we can actually say what logic we want implemented on the actual data incoming to the function. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. So now instead of just returning the same thing every single time, we can return anybody's name and anybody's title, because we've set our function up in that way. Does anybody have any questions on that? Are we feeling pretty comfortable? Sure. Formal greeting name, title. So what you would do is actually just have it so it's name, or title would be there. And then instead of Grace Hopper, you would have name. And so that way, whenever this function is called, anybody can put whatever they want in there, and then it will return those values that they plugged in. So that'll work. You didn't do the plus after title. That's a one-off there. There you go. Alright, let's see here. Oh, that's a fancy mouse. Formal greeting is not defined. Oh, give it a capital G. It's another one off. See, there's a lot of like the meat of it is there. So now you're getting, okay, now you have something to work with. So you have one extra space up there. I need to delete one extra space up below. Right there. There we go. That should be. See, that's why I was talking about one-off errors, yeah. Because that's a huge thing. So like, as an example, like one thing that Kyle, I almost said Kevin. I'm getting there, I promise. One thing that Kyle didn't notice is that he put a lowercase g, which is fine. You can do this in JavaScript. It doesn't need to be camel case. Like, this is totally valid code. But the problem is, again, going back to the tests being written by humans, they're explicitly looking for this capital G. So he was getting an error because he didn't have a capital G here, even though all of the functionality was exactly the same. So keep that in mind when you're going through these tests, because they are looking sometimes for very specific things. Okay, 2-parameter function. Write a function called which is longer. It should accept 2 strings, return the longer of the 2 strings. So we get to use a string method. Anybody remember the name of the method that we're going to be using on the strings to determine their length? It starts with a dot. It's pretty easy, but we're all learning here. It's all good. That's why we're here. Functions. That's why we're spending so much time on functions, because they're very complex. It's obviously a lot more difficult than just declaring variables. So that's why we're spending so much time on functions. So essentially, what you could do is you could just come in and say return for. Okay, I could do a conditional here. I could show you guys conditionals. I wonder if it'll let me do string concat. Holy moly. Hopefully they're applauding the air conditioning technician. Expected, okay. I think I did that backwards. This is what's called the ternary. I just wanted to see if this would work. I can explain this real quick for you guys, if this works. Yeah. So basically, this is like a if statement. I could just change this up. What I was trying to do is this: if first dot length. That's what I was talking about with the method before, by the way. We know first is a string because it says it in the instructions. It says it should accept 2 strings, so it gives us that bone, right? So we know for a fact that we're working with the string data type. And so knowing that, if you were brand new like you guys are, I would definitely recommend going over, if you're stuck, and typing in JavaScript string methods. Come on in here. And right there, right away, we know we have access to this. But for instance, if I was stuck on this function, I didn't know exactly how to do this. If I knew the data type I was working with, you could look up the methods that you can call upon them in order to do operations that would otherwise take you a lot of time to do yourself. Like dot length is essentially creating a for loop, which we'll get into. But you can imagine it as it's going through every single letter and it's counting it. Now, writing that code ourselves is possible. It's actually probably not that hard, but the fact that the method is there, everybody uses it, it's built into JavaScript, it's just considered the proper way to code. So we're using the dot length method instead of writing our own dot length method here. And in case you're ever stuck, again, we have string methods. We also have number methods, array methods. Whatever data set you're working with, there's almost certainly a method on it. I think the only exceptions are Booleans, because Booleans are obviously the most basic of all data types. It's either a 1 or a 0. I'm not sure how much more you could do with that. Yeah, so this is W3 Schools. Let me write, well, I guess it's recorded, but yeah. I like this one a lot because it's definitely more beginner friendly. The other one is MDN, which is Mozilla Developer Network, I think. It's Mozilla Firefox. They also have really good JavaScript documentation. So there's W3 Schools. Stay on there a little bit longer. And then we can also go so this one I would say is good for you guys now because it's definitely more geared towards simpler explanations and understanding. But if you get to a point where you wanted to like really understand what was going on, I think that Mozilla Firefox, MDN, I think their documentation is much more in depth, and it goes through like a lot more intricacies of exactly what's going on. So we can see over here, you can ignore this prototype. This has to do again with the constructor. It's just saying it's a string type. That's what the prototype means. It's the string type. Notice how this is capitalized, the S, so it's the string constructor. And again, so this is why I recommended W3 schools, because this is a little more technical, but we have the constructor constructing a prototype of a string, and then the example is this is the method that you would call on a string. So this is just representing the simplest form of a string, essentially. This is what this is saying. A string prototype is just a string, just a basic string. So you can go through, and again, you can find up here. Let's find dot length, match all. Oh, why is that at the top? Oh, because it's a property. And so if we scroll down, we get like a meaty description. It shows like how to use it, assigning. It goes even as far as to show you like actual documentation and in ECMA script. So if you really wanted to try and understand what's going on under the hood for these methods, you could come here. But again, I think that W3 kind of cuts off a lot of that like unnecessary stuff for you guys to know now. You could see obviously like they have this try for yourself button. Definitely makes it a lot easier to understand the methods if you can actually see it being used in the proper sense. So W3 is great. If you want to understand things on a deeper level, MDN docs is probably what you want to do. I'm trying to think if there's any other sites I should share with you guys while we're on that topic. But real quick, we can finish this up. So this is what's called a conditional. Are we familiar with conditionals? I don't think we talked about those, right? Where are they? How did I have this thing? There we go. No, conditionals are down here. Okay.
But you didn't say first day, first night, you spoke about.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. I wish conditionals were above. I feel like conditionals are far more simpler than functions because I'm putting a anyway. So obviously here, I think you guys can understand what's going on. I'm not going to return here. This would actually error out because I'm returning an expression. You don't want to do that. So not going to return. I'm going to just put my conditional just like this. So line by line, if we go through, I'm declaring these two parameters that we're expecting to be strings. And then I'm putting this if keyword. It's a keyword. You can tell because it's purple. And then just like a function, we're going to open those parentheses on either side. And this is like you're asking a question to the computer. You're saying, is this true or is this false? And this is where the Boolean comes in. A conditional will always return a Boolean. You don't see the Boolean, but it acts upon the Boolean. So what you do is you say if, and so you can think of this mentally as if this is true, it would be the same thing. I just want to show a quick example. Ideally, it would be if true, do this. That's essentially what we're going for with an if statement right now at this point. So if this statement is true, we're going to open some curly braces, just like a function. It's called a code block. We're going to open a new code block for if this statement ends up being true. So I'll show you guys that. We're trying to find which of the two strings coming in, the first one and the second one, are longer. So I'm going to use the dot length method that we were just looking at on W3 schools, and I'm going to use a conditional, and I'm going to say if the first length is greater than the second length, open up the curly braces. I'm going to say return first. Does it want the string? Yes. Return first, right? The cool thing about conditionals is it allows you to put more than one return because you're expecting there to be two outcomes, right? It can either be true or it can be false. So there's this keyword called else. See how it turned purple? ELS, else. All of a sudden it's purple. So this is kind of like the peanut butter to the jelly that is if. You would do If this is true, then do this. Else, if it's false, then do this. You can think of it that way. So you're asking the computer, hey, is this true? If it is true, then please do this. If it's not true, then please do that. And I'll show you guys that. You don't actually need to necessarily open up curly, you don't need to enter in parentheses. Sorry, I'm having a hard time remembering all the symbol names. I feel like I'm in the Matrix sometimes, trying to remember all this stuff. I'm sure you guys do too. So with an else statement, you're anticipating there to be no other condition to be passed, and that's, in this instance, correct. There is something else called an if-else. This would be used if you did want to pass another condition. It doesn't apply in this scenario. I just want to show you real quick. I'm sure we'll talk about it when we hit conditionals, but in this instance, if I wanted to use if, else if, and else, I would do else if first dot length equals second dot length. Did it do? Okay, cool. Return. That ain't right. Else. I wonder if this will error out. Because technically it should never hit that else if. So let's actually try this. Returns the first string when they're the same length. Oh, so there is a, okay. Oh, so we can do an else if, okay. Oops. I didn't even notice that. Does it say that up there? If the strings are the same length, return the same. Oops. Okay, so yeah. What's going on is the computer is reading, again, just want to drill this home, left to right, top down. So first it's going to evaluate this very first statement. It's going to say if this first string, so these are the examples here, right? It makes it kind of easy to visualize what's going on. If this is longer than the second one, then return that, just like it asks it to. Return the longer of the two strings. So that's what we're checking. We're checking with a conditional. We're saying if it's longer, then return it using the greater than symbol. Greater than, return. Else, if. So if this is false, this will not run. This is never going to run if this is false. This always needs to be true. So if this is not true, it's not going to return, so we don't need to worry about our code exiting out of our function early. If this is false, it's just going to skip and go to this else if line. So then we have here, I'm comparing if the first dot length is completely equal to the second dot length. This you probably don't need because it's probably going to be an integer. I consider it good practice. If it errors out when you do that, try erasing it. If it works, then just roll with it. But typically you want to always try and use 3 where possible because that makes it so that you're ensuring that the data type is also what you're expecting it to be. So this is very similar to the first one. The only difference being it's prefaced with else, signifying this should only run if this ends up being false, which is what we want. We don't always want this to run. So if this is true, run. Since it's false, we're going to say, okay, here's our new if, right? This is false, so now else if. So now we can just read this like a new if statement. If the first dot length is strictly equal to the second dot length, return first, because it says right here, if they're the same length, return the first string. So that's what I'm doing right here. Finally, else doesn't need the parentheses because we're not passing any condition. Else is meant to be like the final, like if you finally hit this point, you need to give them something to, you need to have something to return essentially because you're at the, let's say you had a worker who needed to work, infinitely long. If you never had a final condition for him to complete, then, okay, this is a bad example. That sounded good in my head, and then I started talking about it. Let me think. This is essentially like a catch-all statement. This isn't necessarily what your code is going to be hitting most of the time, but you want to make sure that it's written in a way where It's very concise, simple, and you know exactly what it's doing. In this case, it's really easy to understand, but once you start writing more complicated code, you'll notice that you'll start writing a lot more else if statements and stuff, and this can get kind of convoluted. Just make sure that in your else statement, it's returning like the last possible thing you want it to return. You still want it to return something, but in this instance, the reason it's written like this is because there are 3 conditions. 2 of the conditions is that one of the 2 strings should be returned if they're longer. So we have that taken care of essentially right here. I'm saying if the first one is longer, return the first one, else return the second one. But the 3rd condition that they kind of slipped in there, I didn't notice it at first, is right here. The 3rd condition is if the strings are the same length, return the first string. So there's 3 conditions that we need to consider, and that's exactly why we have 3 conditionals to, properly address those 3 conditions that the problem gives us. The reason I have this else if here first is because I want my else statement to return the second one, because there are 2 instances where we're returning the first, and so I want to make sure that I'm running the conditions to check if this one is the one that we want first before this. If I had like else if or just else return second here, if I moved this up, it's probably not going to let me do it, so I'll just do this. It's bad. If I had that there, it wouldn't evaluate this line down here, line 6. It would literally just be like if blah, 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 else return second. If it was the same length, it would never evaluate to true. It would never hit this statement, because else is the peanut butter to the jelly of if. Like, these 2 come together. The only way you can kind of separate them is by putting them together, which is kind of
Makes sense. So it's like, I want A or B.
But if
And
neither of those,
one of those, give it C. Well,
Yeah.
I already picked A or B, so.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So this should finally work. I just realized we probably could have done the AND operator here, or the OR operator, but let's see if this works first. Cool. All right. Sure.
For some reason, my lamps are not going orange. I don't know.
Could
And so is error. What I see, I have exactly what you have.
okay. I'll come take a look. You're good. Give me just 1 second. So another thing you could have done too, instead of doing the if, else statement, is you could have done the OR operator. We talked about this. Change color, just paste that in, because we're returning the same thing, right? So I no longer need that else if. Now I just have the one if conditional and then the else. And the reason I'm able
So the double parallel lines means else.
or. It just means or, yes. And so a conditional is a question. We're asking the computer a question. Is this true? We have the OR operator and we have the AND operator. This is the OR operator, and let me just check real quick. This should still work, right? Because we're telling the computer this can be true or this can be true. Then you can return the first. So now we don't need that else if, because instead of putting that new condition inside of that else if, I can just throw in the OR operator because it works that way. We can just say, if this condition is true, return first, or if this condition is true, return first. And then we don't need that else if statement. But yeah, I can take a look real quick. Yeah, let's take a break. It's like really hot in here. What time is it? Let's return at 7:55. Oh, we're commas. Periods. Yeah, so you separate the parameters with commas, but you use methods with periods. So dot length will be a method, and then like inserting data like into there, that's when you use a comma. Otherwise, it's all periods. You still need periods on line 5. And there's a typo on your first length on line 5.
Right, but it kept messing with me, trying to figure out why.
Yeah, that's right.
Why it wouldn't go.
Yeah, there you go.
Because I kept respelling, it. I'm okay, it has to be that.
Yeah. Yeah. Proud. Can't believe how hot it is, man. Wow. Okay, I am going to